Good morning, everybody. It is my absolute pleasure this morning to be joining you from beautiful Northland. I am up in Kerikeri this morning, and it's a privilege to introduce you all to and welcome Emily Hanford. Morning, Emily, and good afternoon, I think, from where you're beaming in to us.
Yes, just barely afternoon, just had lunch.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Emily, for taking some time out of your day. As I've mentioned to you before, you have a very, very big following here in New Zealand, and I'm quite sure that we will also have some people joining us potentially from other parts of this side of the world as well. So, Emily, I'm just going to kick off by introducing you to those who may not be so familiar with your work. So Emily Hanford is a senior correspondent and producer for American Public Media. Her work has appeared on NPR and in the New York Times, Washington Monthly, the Los Angeles Times, and other publications. Emily has won numerous honors, including a duPont-Columbia University Award and the Excellence in Media Reporting on Education Research Award from the American Educational Research Association. Emily is a member of the Education Writers Association Journalist Advisory Board and was a longtime mentor for EWA's New to the Beat program. For the past several years, though, Emily has been reporting on early reading instruction. Her 2018 podcast episode, Hard Words, Why Aren't Kids Being Taught to Read?, won the inaugural Public Service Award from EWA. You can find all of her reporting on reading at apmreports.org/reading, including her new podcast, which I'm absolutely certain has gone viral, Sold a Story, How Teaching Kids to Read Went So Wrong, soldastory.org. Emily is based in the Washington, D.C. area. So, Emily, oh my goodness, I can actually recall the day. I have two really vivid memories where I came across and started following your work. And one was I was en route to Australia and came across Hard Words. And then also I can vividly remember walking around a lake that we have close to where I live, a little lake, and listening and just nodding fiercely as you were talking. So yeah, thank you so much for the contribution that you've made to raising awareness and the influence that you're having with the great work that you do. So perhaps you could just begin by sharing with us a little bit about, so you've been investigating educational achievement and literacy for some years now. What was it that sparked your interest to begin researching what was happening in terms of literacy rates and how we actually teach our children to read?
It's a very good question, and it depends on where I would want to start. I could probably take it all the way back to early things in my life, but I will say this. A lot of people think or assume, for good reason, that I must be as interested as I am in this and have stayed on this topic so long because I must have some personal experience with it. A struggling reader as a child. I was a struggling reader as a child, or I had children who were struggling readers, and neither of those are the case. In fact, I have two children who are pretty much grown now. They're 19 and 22, and they both learned to read pretty easily. One especially, one was one of those kids, who really required very little instruction at all. I think I learned to read pretty easily, and I didn't think very much about how kids learn to read as a result. And I think I probably assumed that it just kind of happens as long as you read to your kids a lot. I mean, I knew that it was a little bit more than that, but I think I just kind of thought it was essentially a natural process, and that probably that it was sort of like learning to talk. Not that you need no instruction at all, but that it comes if you're in the right environment, essentially. So I've been an education reporter since 2008. And I didn't really think about those questions at all. And most of what I was reporting on was actually older kids, because in my reporting overall, I think a question or an issue that has sustained my interest in education, has driven my interest in education, has to do with like equity and opportunity, and whether and how schools and schooling contribute to or not a more equal society. I mean, that's the idea behind public education. So we're giving everyone an opportunity. And I've just always been interested in that question about how schools do that, whether schools do that, how they could do it better, all that. And a lot of that really was focused more on college, university, right? Because we know how important that is to opportunity and success and economic mobility. And so I did a lot of work on preparation for higher education, different kinds of higher education, getting away from just the idea that you have to go get a university degree, but other pathways to economic mobility, but what's the education that people need to get those? Anyway, back in 2016, I was reporting on college students who are in so-called remedial classes. And so these are students who had graduated from high school in the United States, been told sort of by virtue of graduating from high school that they were ready for college, went to college, and then were put in these remedial classes. And I met a bunch of students who told me about their struggles with reading, and I'd never really thought about it before. And I got into this topic initially with an interest in dyslexia, because I met some students, one student in particular, who told me about how she had dyslexia, not something that anyone else had ever identified, not something she'd gotten any kind of appropriate or good help with when she was in school. And I started being really interested in this question of, is one of the big barriers for success in higher education that there are a lot of students who have learning challenges, learning disabilities that aren't getting identified and aren't getting good help when they're young. And I think it is. I think that there is a lot going on there. So I got really interested in dyslexia in particular, which I knew nothing about. And that led me very quickly to this core instruction problem, because it's very clear, a few things are very clear when you start looking at the research on dyslexia, when you start talking to dyslexic people and their families, is that one part of the problem here is that kids in the United States, many of them, are not actually being taught how to read when they're in school. And this is having the biggest impact on kids with dyslexia. They're like the canaries in the coal mine here, showing us that there's a problem. And obviously kids with dyslexia do and will, even if core instruction were perfect, many of those kids are still going to need more help than they can get from a classroom teacher who has 25 6-year-olds to teach how to read. But their problems are being made more severe by the fact that they're not getting classroom instruction. And a really important thing, which is I think some of the problems that kids with dyslexia have getting identified in school and getting the help they need, goes down to some bigger issues about the fact that many of the people in the school don't know what they could or should know about reading and how it works. So they don't really understand why these kids are struggling. They don't understand dyslexia. They don't understand what kind of help they need. In many cases, they actually really don't have the help that many of these children need. And you hear stories over and over again in the US about parents going to schools, sort of like shaking the tree, like something is wrong here. She's not reading, he's not reading. And they feel like they're an alternative reality because the school is saying, it's fine, don't worry, it's fine. And I think part of what's going on there is that the school itself doesn't have systems designed to catch this problem, to understand it, or at the end of the day, to know what to do about it. And we have a federal law here in the United States which says that schools have to help these kids. And I think that there's a little bit of denial, and I'm not going to say it's like conscious or ill-intentioned all the time, but by recognizing dyslexia, they are then obligated. Well, they're even obligated if they don't recognize it, but then it becomes a thing where they have to fix it. And I think in many cases, they haven't known how. So long-winded answer is it started with dyslexia, and I am as surprised as anyone that I'm still on this topic 5 years later, because it just kept getting, there were so many layers of this onion. There were so many things to explore and peel away. But I went from dyslexia to core instruction and just understanding some things about how kids learn to read and realizing that there could be some real power in a journalist explaining some of this.
Absolutely.
So I would say, you talked about walking around the lake and listening to hard words. I mean, that was a piece of very just straightforward explanatory journalism. I just explained some key concepts about reading and how it works and showed something about what's up in the real world. And I think started to identify a problem that then I stayed on for longer and sold a story, was really the result of years of explanatory journalism and recognizing that there's some why here. There's some like, why is this so? Why don't teachers know what they need to know? Why are schools reluctant to identify kids with dyslexia? What is going on? And sold a story was, I would say, went from being explanatory journalism to a more investigative piece, trying to understand the why and the accountability questions, which I think are really important.
Yeah, I think that, you know, when I'm sitting here listening to you, and I think there'll be a lot of other people who are thinking the same. When you talk about equity in education, I think those challenges with equity in education span worldwide, don't they? You know, what you're talking about in terms of your experience and what you found in the United States is actually an international situation. When you said, you know, kids aren't being taught to read, I was listening and I sat in my with my parent hat on, Emily, and I was thinking about, you know, there are so many of us as parents who have this expectation of our kids will go to school and they will learn reading, writing, and I'm going to say arithmetic, and it's not that teachers don't have every intention of teaching every child who is in front of them. I really want to probably add that to what you're saying, because so much of what I myself learned in teacher training college, and you would have heard this, you know, probably your story might be that every time you heard what I'm about to say, if you had $1 for every time, you'd be a very, very wealthy lady. But as a teacher myself in training, I was not taught how our children learn to read. I was not taught how to teach all of the children I was about to teach and all of the children who were under my watch as a school principal. I was not taught how best to teach them to read. And that is part of, I guess, your purpose for doing what you're doing. And part of what you said, there are many facets to the why. That's one part that I'm going to say we really need to expose that more, and encourage teachers to be brave enough to open their minds to accepting that, and encourage parents to be accepting and kind around that being a reality for teachers worldwide.
Yeah, I've thought a lot of things while you were just talking. One of the things that was very interesting to me early on in this reporting is starting to get responses from around the world. So it was very clear, for example, when Hard Words came out, I was hearing from people in New Zealand and Australia and Canada and England and the French speaking world and the Spanish speaking world. You know, at first I think the difficulty of written English contributes to some of the problems we have with teaching it to children. Yeah. French is similar in being a complex orthography. You would think that like in the Spanish speaking world, they wouldn't have this problem at all, because it's relatively easy to teach kids written Spanish. The sound symbol relationships are fairly direct, but I think there are a lot of problems there because in some of the ways that this is political. But in what you were talking about parents expect that when they send their kids to school, they will learn how to read. What's interesting is you weren't taught, and I would be a very rich lady if I had $1 for everyone who told me that they were never taught how to teach reading. And, you know, so there's this strange thing going on. So many people weren't taught how to teach reading. They get into schools and they realize that, and they think, and you know, why wasn't I taught this? And you'd think that would, like, a lot of people have that as like their own experience, but it wasn't sort of, you would think that would just be so obvious that teachers would need to be taught something about how to teach kids to read. And I think one of the reasons it hasn't been fixed sooner, it wasn't as obvious as it should be, is that there really is a deeper idea at work here, which is that reading doesn't really need to be taught. Not that there's no role for a teacher. This is very,
yes.
but that it really is essentially something that children will pick up. And so even though parents send their kids to school and expect that they will learn how to read, I think there's some people deep down, there's a difference between learning something and being taught it, right? So you expect your children will learn to read. Do you expect your children will be taught how to read? You probably do. But if you start pressing down in what we all might, like beliefs that we've kind of absorbed from the culture, I think a lot of people do have that kind of idea, like, well, as long as you're around enough books, you eventually do, right? So, because this idea, one of the things that has come out of decades of scientific research is this very clear, profound finding, which is that our brains aren't wired to read. It's not something we're meant to do, because we haven't been doing it very long as human beings, right? And so many people are like, that's a huge aha moment for them with well, really? Learning to read is not natural? Our brains aren't wired to do it? As soon as you start to really nod your head on that one, it opens up this whole big area now.
Yeah.
So
absolutely. Yeah. And what's really, I'm hoping that there will be an increasing number of teachers watching this and parents, Emily, who have invested some time in learning about that and about how, at a really kind of high level, how the reading network is formed in the brain, because I can speak from my own experience. That is the game-changing moment and the real aha moment. And the reason that as a parent, I understood, and a teacher, that when I was sitting on the couch, on the red couch actually, with my 5-year-old little boy, who was the first one in our family to school, and he knew the word on one page and didn't know it on the next, and then didn't know it on the next after I told him, I now know and understand what I was and wasn't doing, and how the books that he was reading weren't set up to support him to become a reader, because I have a little bit more knowledge of how the brain learns to read, and that brain must be taught in most cases, or must be in an environment that's conducive to it being able to, dare I say, self-teach once it has hooked onto some of that code and can build on, that the orthography without us getting all too complex that, that it has got going on there. So,
but I actually think I think that's actually a really important point, and maybe something does start to get lost when we start to acknowledge and accept how important deconstruction is. We often not forget the self-teaching part of it, and the implicit learning, because that is a huge thing. Most of what many of us know about reading and how we really became expert readers was actually stuff that we sort of taught ourselves through reading. It's just, how does it begin? How do kids begin to make sense of this system so that it becomes a sort of multiplicative, exponential experience where they are statistically learning, as the way Mark Seidenberg puts it. And we know that some kids, that putting some of that stuff together is always going to be harder for them, right? They're going to need a lot more of the explicit instruction and may never get as quick and efficient at reading the words as some people can get, right? Some people, even though we're not born with brains that are wired to read, some of us can become very, very good readers. So it is possible that we can overdo it in some cases on the explicit teaching. At a certain point, we really do have to recognize that kids go off and teach themselves a lot of what they need to know. And that when you're sitting on the red couch with your little 5-year-old who's going off to school, all of those moments that you're sitting there with that child and reading to him and with him are playing a huge role in his ultimate ability to be a good reader. That language comprehension piece of things is gigantic. And my work has definitely focused more on the word reading part of things, and how many schools have just gotten that very wrong because there have been some wrong assumptions sort of at play about how this whole reading thing works. And it's I think it's actually the part that's easiest to fix, right? So the word reading part is teachable and can be taught. And I think schools can be doing a much better job. But we do know that two things, that the rest of the part, the language comprehension part, and the fact that there are some kids who really cannot remember one word, a word from one page to the next, and that those kids really need targeted kinds of help. We have to keep both of those things in mind as we move forward here.
Yeah, so true. And, when you're talking about how it begins, and I think there'll be parents and there'll be teachers who are just embarking on opening their minds to understanding a little bit more around the various disciplines that contribute to that massive body of research called the science of reading. And I think for those parents, would you agree that in a nutshell, without again getting too complex, we want our children to be taught to learn to read in much the same way that we teach them to learn to swim. We put them on the side of the pool. We teach them to turn their back to the water and slide in. We start with very, very basic foundation skills before we put them into the 25-meter deep pool and expect that they will be able to swim from one end to the other, which I liken that swimming from one end to the other to going to opening a book that's full of a whole lot of different words with a whole lot of different code. There's no way that we can do that. So in our reading instruction, we want to see schools having a really conscious focus on teaching foundation skills from simple, really, really simple, to complex in a step-by-step manner. And we might say, in a systematic and cumulative way, so that we can build skill on skill on skill. And for teachers to know and observe, because they have increased knowledge, what is going on here. So those canaries in the coal mine, love that, Emily, those canaries in the coal mine, they're not canaries in the coal mine and are in such a foreign environment. They're in an environment that, it's canaries in the aviary, not in the coal mine. They know they can live and survive.
Well, the canaries in the coal mine, it's helpful though, because the stakes are high here. In your analogy about the pool, you would not throw a little child who didn't know how to swim, because that child could drown and die. And the stakes are really high. And it's very important to teach kids those foundational skills early so that they can survive and survive well. And this is one of the things that I learned. This was a big aha moment for me in understanding stuff about how the brain learns to read, which is that if kids aren't taught well early, they can pick up bad habits. They start doing things that it turns out they're using parts of their brain that are not efficient and effective for reading. They try to memorize words, and then we do things in school like we tell kids to memorize words. We have them go home with sight words, and memorizing the words as like pictures or holes is not an effective, efficient way. It works for a little while. You can memorize a certain number of them. So Sold a Story came out of when I started to realize that some of what I see being taught frequently in schools in the United States are actually the strategies that struggling readers use. Memorize the words, guess the words, use just one of the letters or a couple of the letters, think of something that makes sense, get to a big, long, multisyllabic word and just get the gist of it, think of a word that could be wildly off. So this is why teaching foundational skills is so important, is because we don't want kids to start picking up bad habits with reading. Because habits are hard to break of all kinds. And when and what you're trying to get your brain to be able to do is read words reflexively, like it's like a reflex, but you don't want to train it the wrong way, because then you get it to start doing reflexively the wrong things. And you don't want that. You don't want that, because you need this. The profound insight is that for those of us who get to be good, efficient readers, we know tens of thousands of words instantly on sight. And that's one of the big reasons why we're good readers, because we don't have to think about the words consciously. We know the words, almost all of them. And instead, we are putting our brain power into trying to figure out the meaning of what we're reading, which is the goal. That's where we want everyone to get to. We've had we've had sometimes the ends and the means confused in reading instruction.
Yes.
Everyone agrees that the goal is for kids to understand what they read, but some approaches to reading have decided that if you start with comprehension and you do kind of everything in the service of getting to comprehension as quickly as possible. And that includes things like just memorize the words, oh, look at the picture, look at the first letter. Oh, give them these pattern books that they can read so that they can get right into the good part. And then what has been lost here is that we are not giving kids the actual efficient best way of getting to the point of being good readers. And English is hard, and it takes a few years, even for kids that don't have any kind of learning issues, any kinds of learning disabilities, to really master this whole written English thing. So
yeah. I just want to pick up on one point, and I've actually written this down, Emily, where you said strategies that we teach or strategies that we have previously been teaching are actually the strategies of struggling readers. I know when I heard that, I sat with it for a really, really long time, and I consciously encouraged myself to sit with it and look for it more so through a different lens. And it really did help me to understand and begin to identify some of the differences with students who did have a more developed reading network in their brain, where they were activating all parts and being able to orthographically map words, compared to those who couldn't do that. Yeah, so when you think about, you've obviously come across lots of patterns, and we've talked through the course of the conversation around some of those things. What would you say are one or two solutions that you've become aware of, I guess I really want to say at this point that parents and educators and policymakers really deserve to know about, but also that ultimately they should really be considering through the course of their conversation with teachers, through the course, particularly, I'm going to say for policymakers, what is it that really ultimately we've missed in terms of making decisions that are going to set the record straight?
I think a lot of the problems, at least here in the United States, I can't speak per se to what's going on in other places, has to do with assessments. I mean, a lot of it is that we have not put into place things that are identifying the problems, like picking up the kids who have issues and really need extra help, or giving parents, teachers, and others enough information about what the problem is, right? So the assessments have been very broad. We tend to use a sort of leveled reading system here in the United States, where kids are, a lot of parents, only information they get is he's a level C, and by the end of the quarter, we want him to be a level D. And what does that mean? And I talk about some of the problems with that level lettering benchmark assessment system. I think that's a really important thing that people need to look into more carefully. I think it's important to recognize as people here in the United States are trying to fix core instruction. I want to go back to what I said at the beginning, which is fixing core instruction isn't going to be enough for all kids. So everyone's got to keep their eyes on the prize with interventions and struggling readers. I'm not a huge fan of like technology, but I actually think that there are some technological solutions that can help us. I think with all kids and little kids in particular, we have to really think hard about devices we put in kids' hands. And I think we really, especially with kids who are struggling readers, want anything and everything to sort of be done with an adult there, that there needs to be like a human being that is part of this. But I do think that there are some ways that technology can really, some good programs that I think little kids can use that can help them. So, but it's always, here in the United States, there's a lot changing, and policy is such an important part of this puzzle. But policy has unintended consequences all the time. People have to make decisions about particular programs or particular language in bills, and those things can become restrictive or prescriptive in ways that aren't helpful. So it's like we need good policy, but I actually think at the end of the day, the most important thing here is teacher and educator knowledge, and parent knowledge too, but especially teacher and educator knowledge. And I think it's the most powerful thing, because in response to the reporting, I've heard from teachers more than any other group. And we actually did we counted up the responses we'd gotten to Sold a Story, and we by far have heard from more teachers than any other kind of person. And most of them are saying like, thank you, I'm so grateful. I didn't know this, or I didn't know it till recently. And this is so helpful, and I want to know. And it was really hard at first, and they feel guilt and shame and resistance in many cases. But then many of them have been saying things like, this is the most exciting moment in my career. I've been doing this for 20 years and I haven't felt so intellectually stimulated and so excited about the possibilities. That's wonderful. And, you know, thank you to all the teachers out there who are doing a lot of hard and extra work to try to get this right.
It is, because it does feel like you starting again. It feels like you know, you're a beginning teacher again when you, and that's okay. I think it is. It's really empowering. It's really empowering to build that knowledge. But you know, Emily, I can speak from experience and say that there is nothing more rewarding than being able to execute that knowledge because you have it and you physically can sit across from children and support them and help them to see that actually they too can become a reader by you teaching them in a systematic way from simple to complex, and by you building your knowledge and your teaching practice with some physical prompts and cues at times that will really support them. It's an incredibly rewarding, way more rewarding than any other educational experience that I have had. So it's pretty cool for us to be able to sort of lead into kind of wrapping this chit chat up on that really positive note of, you know, that it isn't all doom and gloom, and that actually those teachers that are out there who really, and those school leaders who do invest in building, like you said, you know, really ultimately the biggest thing is teacher and educator knowledge. Knowledge is total power in this situation, and opening our minds to that. I just really quickly want to pick up on one thing that you talked about, and I wrote down the word alignment. You know, like you said, core instruction is not enough, because if we just focused on core instruction, we still will have the odd canary in the coal mine, and we'll see them even more so. We will see those canaries in the coal mine more so just by changing our core instruction. We really want to work towards an alignment of what we do and what you call our core instruction and what we call here in New Zealand our tier 1 mainstream classrooms into tier 2 with learning support, and then with real specialist intervention. There's got to be that consistent evidence-based educational pathway and supports wrapped all the way around. So great to connect with you this morning, Emily. I feel like we could sit here and just and chit chat all day, but we've both got to keep moving. And I just want to take this opportunity to share with all our listeners that we have some really exciting news, and had been in the pipeline now probably for, gosh, I don't know, it might be 3 or 4 months to work with you on this, but really super excited to share with our listeners that we're going to be bringing you to New Zealand in August for our inaugural really science of reading focused symposium that we're calling Cultivating the Literacy Landscape. So looking forward to having you join us in Christchurch in Auckland, Emily, on the 28th and 30th of August.
Me too. Never been there.
Super exciting. So and you're going to be joined by Pamela Snow and Lorraine Hammond, who I know you're just going to absolutely love meeting in the flesh. So for those of you who are listening in and that sounds really exciting for you, Emily is going to speak more to the why. So you know, we need to really understand that why in a lot more detail than we've been able to chat to today. And then Pam's going to pick up on the what should that teaching look like, and Lorraine's going to pick up on bringing in her research and experience on talking about the how should that teaching be delivered from her extensive work in the Kimberley in Australia. So yeah, can't wait, Emily. I think we've managed to fit in a little bit of fun along the way too, which will be nice. So. Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us for this chit chat today, and you have a wonderful afternoon. And is there one last message that you'd like to share with all of our listeners this morning?
See you in New Zealand.
Yeah.
We can talk more then.
Yeah, totally. And for those who maybe have just come across Emily's work, I really do encourage you to to get along to soldastory.org, where you can access the podcast. But the podcasts are also easily accessible on Spotify. I know myself, I love to listen to a good podcast while I'm out for a walk. Sometimes I think the people that are walking around me probably think I'm crazy, because I do happen to talk. I do happen to talk to you and others along the way, Emily. So
I've heard a lot about that. I think there's been some swearing and yelling into the wind.
Hey, you know what? And I'm going to say, and a few tears too sometimes. So yeah. So for everybody else, go and have a fantastic day. And looking forward to seeing Emily here live in New Zealand in August. So thanks for joining us, everybody. Have a great day.